saying entertaining.
Sometimes I say things that I would really rather not be public. Now we are live. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out on a Monday night when it's neither cold nor hot in Phoenix. But anyway, it's very pleasant. Thank you, video virtual audience, for joining us. Very pleased to have back in the store Vanessa Lillie, who tells me that her last visit was 2019.
2019 for my debut, Little Voices. Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So happy to be back. Thank you, Barbara.
Well, we're delighted to have you back. And the book is Blood Sisters. And Vanessa has actually been on quite an extensive book tour already because you published, what, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, on Halloween, I launched, and I had a launch party in Rhode Island where I live. Had so much fun. And then I had to take Halloween off because I have a 9-year-old, and that is a sacred day in 9-year-old land. And then I hit the road right after that. So I've been going since then.
It's a sacred day in Scottsdale, too, because the clubbing people put on amazing parties. So we close at 5 in order to flee before.
So did you dress up this year?
Well, I was at home.
Okay.
And, you know, I didn't dress up. And distressingly, because we live in a gated community, we didn't have any little trick-or-treaters. I was so disappointed. But luckily, I was able to bring all the chocolate M&Ms with peanut butter down to the store, so it wasn't all bad. What did you wear?
I wore my son was the Lord of Crows, something he made up, where he had a steampunk hat, and we got some crows and attached them to this hat. And so I did an Instagram live that on my book launch night with my friend Dennis from Scared Straight Reads. And so I first appeared in it with a giant steampunk hat with crows, and I think I scared him, actually, which that's what you're supposed to do on Halloween, so it worked out.
It does work out. It's a very difficult publication date, I know, but yeah. So it goes. So where we are in Blood Sisters is we're starting out in Rhode Island with a woman who, what's her name, Sly?
Sid Walker.
Sid, right. Who really doesn't want to go back to her small town in Oklahoma, but feels that she has to. So why don't you set up the story for us?
Absolutely. I do love a story where your past comes calling and you have to return to the one place you never wanted to go. So Blood Sisters is a story of Sid Walker, and she is an archaeologist for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She is Cherokee from northeastern Oklahoma, just like me. And an ID badge, an old ID badge, is found in some remains near a crime scene that she just barely escaped as a girl. And that crime has haunted her whole life when a friend was murdered. And so once that badge is found, she has to come home. And while she's there, she finds out that her sister, who's had some drug problems and has gone missing. And so Sid is very determined to make sure her sister is not another missing and murdered Indigenous woman statistic. And she'll do whatever it takes, come hell or high water, to find her sister. And so it's really that story of sisterhood and also justice.
So you made her an archaeologist because that gives her some professional expertise, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, archaeology, and particularly within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So for those who aren't familiar with what's called the BIA, they've had a really difficult relationship with tribal nations, even though their job is sort of to manage the land and the relationships there. And through the decades, there's been even some illegal activities. And in the case of my book, it's kind of highlights some of the things that have been done where land is taken from the tribes, land that's valuable with minerals in it. And the money is then taken by the BIA and put into what's called in trust. And the tribes don't get any of that money. But Sid sort of has a foot in both worlds. So she works for the BIA, and certainly these days, you know, that's not as much the case, but there's an understandable distrust. But she is Cherokee, and the reason she is an archaeologist is because she believes in supporting tribes, and archaeology is much more than what we would think with Indiana Jones, which of course that's who we think of. He's like the most famous archaeologist in the world. But it's really about cultural preservation and supporting tribes, and not only making sure that sacred grave sites or artifacts and things are kept where they're supposed to be kept, but it's really preserving their own culture and identity. And an archaeologist is kind of on the ground and able to cultivate those relationships. And so when I did an interview to prepare for this and doing research with an archaeologist, the way that she spoke of her job, and she sort of saw herself as that middle person to help support tribes in a government structure, I thought that's what I want my character to be. I want her to have a foot in both worlds and And also archaeology is really interesting. I loved reading about it. There's several kind of memoirs and things. And I loved learning about it. So and a lot of people have been excited, like, oh, an archaeologist. I'm like, I know, it's kind of a cool job.
It's a very cool job. It's interesting because years ago when I taught crime fiction at ASU, I had some Navajo students in my class. I think there were 4 or 5. And one of the things that we did, because ASU has a really great anthropology, archaeology department. And so I thought, we would all go down there and, they would show us whatever, this was in the 90s, but whatever forensic anthropology stuff was going on. And then I realized that my 5 Navajo students couldn't go. They are not able to see bones. They are not, it's a cultural thing where the Navajo avoid all of that.
Or it could be their ancestors on shelves in university systems.
So I had to come up with, some other field trip for them. And so I found it interesting that, Sid that's not apparently a Cherokee taboo.
No,
as it is a Navajo taboo.
Yeah, not that I've heard of, and certainly there are many archaeologists within BIA who are affiliated with different tribes.
Right.
Yeah.
So just cultural appropriation is another thing that we have. I mean, there's this whole horrible statistical thing with missing Indigenous women, but also like the Smithsonian, along with many other museums, is being called to account for, cultural appropriation. Have you been to the Heard Museum here?
I haven't.
Have you? If any of you, are you familiar with the Heard Museum? It's a stunning museum, basically, of various tribes. Lots of Navajo, lots of Hopi. Well, actually, not lots of Hopi, because the Hopi don't want any of their art or whatever. There was a guy named Jake Page who wrote 3 books about the Hopi, and it was really dangerous. There were death threats. Do you remember, if you lived here, the Arizona Republic had a whole thing I own all 3 of them. I kept them in my library at home. But he broke all these taboos by actually writing about the Hopi gods, the Kachinas. Oh, wow. But the Heard Museum has an astonishing collection, and it's kind of separated here by, various tribes, isn't it? Yeah.
I think the Heard Museum is mostly just the Arizona tribes, which I think there are 22 that are federally recognized here.
Okay, and they have fabulous baskets, and they have, but they have an extensive Kachina collection, and they sell beautiful native made jewelry in their gift shop and the whole bit. So it might be worth going to.
Absolutely, yeah.
On another time. The other thing I found interesting about the Cherokee is that there has been this whole thing going on in Oklahoma about the Supreme Court. It's causing a gigantic law enforcement issue because, well, you probably
and I'm not an expert on it at all, but the McGritt Supreme Court decision essentially returned tribal lands to the management of the tribes, which is certainly a good thing and a thing that needed to happen. But there's some pretty natural, I think, growing pains associated with it, and just legally, I was actually just talking to a tribal lawyer 2 days ago. Just legally, it's hard. Anytime you have a new area of law, there's going to be a lot of growing pains. And, I think there's these examples in the media of like people not getting speeding tickets because they're members of the tribe or things like that. And that's fine. But I think at the end of the day, we do need to be asking questions about what does returning this kind of tribal sovereignty look like, right? And we're not going to do it because it's easy, and we're not going to do it because it's a clean process. But I think, in this case, there is a lot of land owed that should be returned and managed, particularly in places like where Blood Sisters is set. I mean, Pitcher, Oklahoma is in northeastern Oklahoma. It was Quapaw land. And when it was taken over by the BIA and really Congress actually even passed an act helping them steal it from the Quapaw tribe. And then they let mining companies come in. This is in the early 1900s. And there was absolutely no rules and regulations. They came in, they made billions of dollars, produced over half the bullets that were used in the world wars. It went from a tiny little 1,000-person community to almost 20,000 people, almost overnight. And then when it went bust in the 60s, all those businesses pulled out without an interest, of course, in the community. And so all of the mines, because to get lead out of the earth, you got to dig under it. These huge caverns and thousands of miles underneath the grounds of tunnels suddenly flooded with water, and it became what the EPA called one of the most toxic places in America. It was one of the earliest EPA Superfund sites, in fact. Yep. And And the people then in that community were stuck. And some of them wanted to be. It's the place they've lived for generations. But other people, especially as they started to see things like lead poisoning and what it does to children, developmental delays, kidney disease. I mean, we have our per capita of dialysis centers in northeastern Oklahoma. There's just a lot of very serious health issues. So when this story is set, it's actually in 2008, because that was a big turning point for that community. There was, for the first time, a federal buyout program of the homes. So all the people in the community are being asked to leave this place, and there's a monetary value being put on their home, which they generally don't agree with. And then they have to try to find another home, and it's very contentious. There's a committee that oversees this process, and no one's happy about it. And then in the midst of this, there's a big increase in methamphetamine production, which all of this is based on real research. As a reader, my favorite thing is when you're reading something and you love it, and then you go look it up and find out that it's true. And so the characters are not true because I don't want to get sued. But all of the research and all of the history of the town, I mean, I grew up there, and I went back with that writer lens perspective to learn about it. All of that is true. If there's any aspect that's kind of interesting to you, then I think you'll be able to research it and, and find out more about it. And so all of those aspects were in there, and that environmental piece was big. And it ended up, I just was driving actually through Pitcher yesterday, and it's a ghost town now. The Quapaw tribe does have the land again. There's some kind of fire vehicle, things there, but no one can live there. The land is completely ruined and toxic and dangerous.
It was, small towns are a natural setting for mystery stories. Well, there are plenty of urban ones too, but small towns, have like long histories, long secrets, and people know each other in a way that often urban communities don't. And so I was very taken with your portrait of this town that's undergone that. But I was also thinking, geography has so much to do with it. I mean, we have a reservation right over here on the edge of Scottsdale, and they have their own police. And, the Scottsdale police and the reservation police. What tribe is it, Patrick? Right out here? The Pima, isn't it? Is it the Salt River Pima? Right. And there was a really dramatic chase. Do you remember that a while back where I can't remember whether the guy was, he was fleeing or something. Anyway, and he would dodge into the reservation and the Scottsdale police couldn't find him. And it just, illustrated these jurisdictional problems that if you have different, authorities in charge.
Right. And that's part of the kind of issue around missing and murdered Indigenous women is that, when someone does go missing, who do you call?
Right.
And if something happened over there, you don't call the Scottsdale police, even though maybe they're equipped to provide support. In some tribal communities, I don't know in this case, but in some tribal communities, they don't always have enough authority, especially if it's like a kidnapping or something like that. That's a very serious investigation. So then you got to call in the FBI. Well, let me tell you what the FBI doesn't care about. It's missing girls and women. It's got to have drugs involved to get them involved, especially when this is set in 2008.
Yeah, but kidnapping is a federal crime. So,
but it depends if it's a girl who has a record, if it's a family that has a reputation, and they're not there right away. It's 28, it's 48, it's a week before they get out there. Mm-hmm. And we all know those early hours are some of the most important. And so there's a lot of community, they're just missing, they're not believed even. And so I think that's part of the crisis is jurisdiction, but also just people being believed in these cases. So
Sid is in Rhode Island, leading her best life, and suddenly she has to go back to Oklahoma. Why is she in Rhode Island? Why did you you live in Rhode Island.
That's where I live,
I guess I already know the answer.
Write what you know.
but I didn't know that when I read the book, because she could have been living. Anyway, the point was she lived away.
She sure did. Yeah, she created something I learned in my 30s, I'm in my 40s now, was this idea of boundaries. That you can set boundaries with people, and you can set physical and you can set emotional boundaries. And for Sid as a character, I decided that she had created both physical and emotional boundaries with her sister, who has a pretty serious drug problem, and it just kind of got to be too much. Mm-hmm. And I think boundaries are important, and that's not to say you shouldn't keep them. But I think in Sid's case, this story is a little bit of her learning to lift those boundaries and let people back in, especially when they can prove themselves to you. And so she has created this geographic boundary of being kind of across the country. And she's also on Narragansett native land, and where I live on Narragansett land. So I wanted to kind of incorporate the place that I live, and mostly wrote this book. And the sequel will be all in Narragansett land in Rhode Island as well. But for me, I knew that I wanted to write an Oklahoma book. It was where I'm from, and it's the story I wanted to tell. And particularly for the first book, being Cherokee, I wanted to go back to the place where I was raised. And even my main character, her last name is Walker, and that's the name of my ancestor who was on the Trail of Tears, George Washington Walker. So I gave her that last name. And in the book, there's also a family cemetery, the Walker Family Cemetery, which is a real place. It's part of our allotment land. All of my mom's side family have been buried there. And so much about Indigenous culture is the fight against erasure. And so for me to use the real places, to use real language, to use real names really felt important because it sort of is that mantra that so many tribes say, which is, we are still here. And it was sort of that reminder. I was signing books early, and I was sharing that I got picked for this Target book club, and I had to sign 6,000 pages for it. And even though that's a lot, I knew that on every page I would write Wado, which means thank you in Cherokee, because I was not going to miss the opportunity to have a Cherokee word in 6,000 homes. And all the books I signed for you tonight also, I signed Wado, because it's important to me that that language live on, because there was a time when they tried to stop it.
Well, that was not just Cherokee, but...
all language, absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, actually, we have a Canadian with us tonight. The Canadian with First Nations history in children is pretty terrible.
Yeah.
Right here. And we have Indian school is right over here,
Yeah,
so,
the residential schools.
Right.
There's a lot of, I think in Canada they have the phrase truth and reconciliation, because there is so much trauma on both sides of the border. Absolutely.
Right. But what's interesting is that the Cherokee are actually not native to Oklahoma.
Absolutely.
They are native to North Carolina. When I used to live in Virginia and go over to North Carolina, I've been to the pageant at I'm trying to remember what it's called, but anyway, it's the whole Trail of Tears pageant that they conduct there to tell you about what happened. So do you all know about what happened to the Cherokee?
Yeah.
Right, and why they're in Oklahoma? Yeah, so they actually had to take land from other tribes in Oklahoma and give them to the Cherokee. So in a way, the Cherokee were sort of unwelcome and unwitting colonists, weren't they?
Well, they were forced there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't say they took it because they were at gunpoint, but there's a different Osage were all up in that land. I mean, there were several other tribes, and in northeastern Oklahoma in particular, they crowded 9 tribes in that corner, and tribes that had never lived near each other before and had their very own language and culture and things. But that's the point, right? They didn't want them to get along, right? They didn't want them to thrive and succeed. And in my family's case, we were. My side was outside of Nashville, and then we were marched to kind of like an encampment. It's interesting what people picture when they picture the Trail of Tears, but picture soldiers with guns and people who had homes and businesses and communities that they had lived in for generation after generation, just being taken out of their home and left everything behind. And your homes and businesses were then taken by white people and colonizers that take over what you had. And then they were put into almost what you could think of like a cattle pen. And there they had to survive. And I was actually just reading there's all the different stories of, the different marches. There wasn't just one, there were many. And I believe it was the one that my family was on. There was something like, I think there were like 30 births and 55 deaths, so it wasn't just a day, it was months, and it wasn't that life stopped. It was that there were children born on the trail.
That was true of all the people who went west. If you look at the wagon trains and all, babies were born, people died.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, it was a big movement without a kind of transportation that, was safe.
Right. But of course, if you're in a wagon, you're choosing versus, being taken from your home and having to leave everything behind, which is
I'm not sure that everybody on wagon trains, the women, I don't know that all the women were choosing.
Well, that's probably true too. Yeah. Some of them were forced, but at least then you had, things to take with you. And I mean, for some people, you were lucky if you even had shoes, and that's why so many people died on it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. There's a horrendous, I'm trying to remember, what's the Navajo one where they were forced to, was the Canyon de Chelly? the Long Walk, isn't that what it's called? And that, was yet another.
Almost every tribe
example.
has a Trail of Tears. I
Yeah.
mean, I think the Cherokee sort of, that name is known. It's, but every tribe.
It was one of the longest. I think that might be part of it. It's a long way from North Carolina to Oklahoma if you're
Right.
walking. So
Yeah, and it was also such a clear. I mean, the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal,
Right.
and Andrew Jackson still did it anyway with the use of his army. It was also sort of just a kind of a flagrant, abuse of power.
Right.
So that I think also kind of made it maybe more infamous.
true. But what you have here is a novel with a narration, and so it's actually not about history or
No, it's a
polemics.
thriller. I don't know.
I was going to say
It's
that's
not
all the background.
Yeah,
but
I know.
let's-
You're going to start reading and be like, wait a second, I thought I was going to learn about the Trail of Tears. Why are there's like killers with shotguns in the trailer coming after these girls? What's going on? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's possible to write a really good story that still has, if not an agenda, has founded on, based on real things.
Absolutely.
And should make us aware. I think one of the reasons to read crime fiction is that you get to learn stuff that, you might not necessarily learn, and it's more palatable if it's in a story than if you're reading it in a newspaper. No offense there, Christina, but if you're reading it in journalism, it's not quite the same. So Christina's our local NPR reporter, so and a budding novelist.
Yes.
Did you have to unlearn things in order to write a book? I'm putting you on the spot, but still, it's an interesting question. Okay, there you are. Because it's a different process.
Journalism?
Isn't it?
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I know.
That's
Right. So are you envisioning this? I think you already said you were. This is the start of a series?
Yes, Sid Walker continues. When I had created this, I, made a character who had my kind of similar background. And then I was hopeful that then I could kind of move forward and then not just always be in a Cherokee community or a Quapaw community in this case too, but go to other tribal communities, but sort of within my experience. And then, kind of elevate those issues. So right now I'm working on a book that's set in Rhode Island, which is mostly the federally recognized tribe there is the Narragansett tribe. There's other tribes, but, they were there when the first boats came over. I mean, that tribe has been there since the very beginning of colonialism, and New England is certainly the heart of colonialism. And so, for me, I'm just really interested in what that was and what that meant, and then sort of what the modern implications are today. So I've written a draft, and I think it'll be more like a 2025, but I'm really excited about it. And I've been lucky to connect with the Narragansett tribe and some folks there. And actually the word powwow is a Narragansett word, and they have the oldest continuously recorded powwow. It's almost, I think, 360 years now they've had this, they call it their August meeting. And I've been a couple times, and I'm just doing my best to hopefully kind of do right by the tribe and sharing what feels, appropriate. That's not a Narragansett story per se, but, the tribe is front and center, and there's a lot of issues that, just like with this book, I think it'll resonate with people even in their own communities. You don't have to be from northeastern Oklahoma to understand what environmental justice is or missing and murdered issues. And I'm finding very similar threads like that with the sequel. So I'm excited about it.
So if you are going to avoid the difficulty of a police procedural where jurisdiction, I mean, you can't be a cop anywhere other than, where your own jurisdiction is. It's a good thing to have somebody like an archaeologist or an anthropologist who is sort of like quasi, or at least professionally qualified to assist the law, but therefore can move around. Aaron Elkins wrote an amazing series for forever about an a forensic anthropologist called Gideon Oliver, and he went everywhere. The second book, called The Dark Places, was one of our bestsellers forever in the 90s, and it took place in the Olympic rainforest, and it was about the last boy from one of the tribes. He was the last living member, and he was living wild in the Olympic rainforest. It was a terrific book.
Oh, wow.
But the advantage to that was that Gideon could go, just like you're talking about Sid, wherever his expertise was called.
Exactly. So when remains are found, then they need an expert, particularly within the BIA system, because people do travel or get assigned different places because they are often short-staffed. So she can hopefully go to lots of different communities and, raise issues there.
So here's an idea for you. There was I don't remember, I think it was in the New York Times, might have been in the Post. But anyway, the homeless being, increasing, are taking to camping on BIA land or federal, parks and so forth. And the question is, there are lots of difficulties involved in that. And the more remotely they go to live, the farther they are from any sort of emergency or support systems and so forth. But then what are the responsibilities of the rangers if it's in a park, or what are the responsibilities of whoever's managing the land to deal with people who are, and it's apparently an increasing problem. And we just cleaned out the downtown Phoenix, the camp, whatever it's called. The zone, sorry. We had a many blocks, I think it was at least 8 of people who were camping basically in downtown Phoenix. I don't know how they survived the summer. I mean, it was 119. I have no idea what they were, how they were surviving. But anyway, where did they go? Where is the, that's the question.
That's what I've been wondering.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I hadn't really thought about the fact that there is, in fact, a great deal of BIA land, or, national parks are probably not ideal because there are too many people in national parks who will see them.
Yeah. There's some regulation too, usually,
Right.
Depending. Yeah, that'll be interesting to see how tribal communities approach
But that's a conceivable something.
Absolutely.
People come here for plots.
I know. I love that
That's all
idea.
about. I know, but
Absolutely.
seriously, I
It's a
think
great idea.
Yeah, and it's certainly very topical.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
There's lots of things that you can write about. But,
Yeah.
Right. So, do any of you have questions? I know that you guys may have come armed with questions. So, speak up.
Hi.
Buried at Luna's grave.
Oh,
Another missing girl, or do they just fake it?
so the good question is a spoiler. But right. Also, I'll maybe tell you after.
Okay.
That is a good, but it's a good question. It's just a spoiler.
Christina?
There's so much history and then just so much process involved in her job and stuff. So, because clearly you love research, how did you figure out what to put in and what to leave out? Did it kill you every day, or?
Yeah, sometimes I start out overwriting a little bit and then I give it some time to breathe. And I'm actually a very impatient reader. I don't so when I then have let it breathe a little bit, I'll go back and read it. And when I find myself getting bored or anxious while I'm reading, I know I need to cut. So I sort of rely a little less on my writer lens and more as a reader. Sometimes I'll load my books into my Kindle and try to pretend like it's not even my words and read it that way. And like I said, I'm just a really impatient reader. So if I'm getting bored, I know that I need to do some work.
She's not alone in that, let me tell you. So tell us about writer's lens. You've referred to that at least twice in this conversation. What do you mean by writer's lens?
I guess it's sort of how I view things in a way that I want to communicate with other people. For me, writing is usually whatever issues are hot and burning in front of me, and I just want to tell people about them, but I want to do it in a thriller because that's all I read. And so for me, it's the most pressing issues that I'm dying to explain. And the sort of writer lens is, okay, I know you're really interested in environmental injustice, but that's boring if you're writing about it. So how do you write about it in a way that's engaging? How do you set the plot up to be compelling? Where do you put twists in that indicate how you feel about things, but at the same time they're twists and they're interesting. So I kind of have to think about it from that perspective versus my reader view, which as a hat we're all familiar with, and that's a completely different experience. It's how's this going, and do I like the characters, and what's happening in the plot, and is this slow? So I kind of approach it from different directions.
So when you say thriller, how are you defining thriller?
Oh, well, it's actually, that's not a thriller. It's, I guess, a suspense maybe. I think it doesn't feel like a mystery to me. I think suspense is what I've been saying for the most part. And then I kind of also say thriller because that's sort of a shorthand, I think, for a page turner. Genre is hard.
Well, I actually don't care about genre, but since you've been mentioning thriller, I do think an essential ingredient of a thriller is pace. Mm-hmm. If it isn't moving, then, it's not Murder at the Vicarage where we're all, and I love Murder at the Vicarage, I really do. But, the pace is slow and we're having tea and we're talking over secrets in the village. It's the only funny Agatha Christie, I think, is one reason I love it. So, so a thriller, implies, I think, that the story's going to move quickly. That to me is really, and you really need an antagonist. The best thrillers rise and fall on the question of the bad guy
There's
more
some,
than the good
there's some
guy.
pretty mean bad guys in this, and they're a little bit based on real people. The opening scene is also based on kind of a real crime that happened in a nearby town where I grew up. In 1999, it was right after my senior year of high school. 3 men invaded a home and stole 2 girls out of it, murdered one of the girls' parents, and set the trailer on fire. And while the trailer was on fire and everything, the local police came and said that the dad, who they didn't know, but he was dead in that house, because he had a drug record. He probably just ran off with those girls, and they don't need to look for evidence, and they don't need to ask around. He's going to come back with them. And so a whole night went of those girls gone with these 3 awful men and doing, we later learn, God knows what. And the next day the family goes back and they're looking through the burnt trailer and they find the bodies of these 2 people, and they realize that these girls have been taken. The evidence was never collected. So there's a book called Hell in the Heartland by Jax Miller, and that's what, if you're interested in that case, she wrote a great book about it. But for me, I've just watched that as the families have searched since 1999 to bring those girls home and bury their bodies. And there's just nothing worse that you can imagine as a parent or a person. And so for me, just watching it through the decades, I had a lot of anger and the sense of injustice that I wanted to, again, communicate in a way that was compelling. But just last week, I was home reading an article, and the family was in Pitcher, and they'd gotten a tip that maybe the girls had been buried in this house, and they had a digging equipment out, and they didn't find them. And it's just, heartbreaking. And it is indicative of what is happening, particularly around the missing and murdered Indigenous women, where its families aren't believed and cases go cold, and it's just them every day posting on social media, looking for tips. These moms going to, in this case, they would go and talk to drug dealers, and just putting themselves in danger to try to find information to, bring the girls home. And so for me, that was a real case and a real example that I really kind of channeled into this book. And the bad guys in this are loosely based on the real bad guys who did that terrible crime.
It's interesting that the whole sort of crowdsourcing investigations, the true crime podcasting, everybody getting involved in it, has leading to solutions to more crimes, with more eyes on it and more evidence being gathered. What do you think the effect of the was it Killers of the Flower Moon? Do you think that is, bringing more attention to all of this?
Oh, absolutely. So in Killers of the Flower Moon, I'm going
to turn the air conditioning off. It's driving me crazy. Seriously.
The issue was that the oil or head rights of the Osage tribe were being stolen in that community. That the atrocity of that crime led to the birth of the FBI. So I do think there are many people who didn't quite realize that things got that dark when it came to tribal rights. And it's interesting because when I was doing research for Blood Sisters, I was talking to an incredible local environmentalist in my community. Her name is Rebecca Jim, and she is Cherokee, and she was just saying that the Osage and the head rights is very similar to some traditions with the Cherokee and their grasslands. And then in Pitcher, where this is set, it was the Quapaw tribe and the mineral rights. And even though the Quapaw weren't murdered overnight like the Osage were, they did destroy the town and killed the people in the end. And so it is a pattern that we see. And so Killers of the Flower Moon is wonderful because it sheds light on something that has been happening in many communities, and it's not the only community, that's for sure. So yeah, it is powerful. And certainly to see the Osage, their language, which was, almost erased, suddenly on the big screen in a Martin Scorsese film, and all the wonderful Osage actors. And, it seems like they have a lot of community pride around that. So that's great as well.
Well, it was a bestseller, and it had a tremendous reach as a book. But it's never going to have, a book is not going to have the same reach as
Martin Scorsese
as a movie or a TV or whatever. Which is it? I can't even remember.
It's a movie.
It is a movie.
Yeah.
And I think that once that happens, it tends to bring a cluster of similar stories. Every time there's some enormous success as a book or a movie, then we get other people who think, oh, there's a good idea.
And we are living in such an exciting time for Indigenous voices right now. Thank God. I mean, because, you know, when you think about publishing, the way I think of it is like a long table. It's not that long of a table, but it's a long table. And there's just so many seats at that table. And for so long, the Indigenous voices that were shared were people who were white sitting in those seats sharing Indigenous voices. But now that's slowly changing. And the people who are those voices are the actual people, and they're getting to share those stories.
Right. Well, that's it. They recast Tony Hillerman's books, you know, with Native actors, Indigenous actors, and Robert Redford and George R.R. Martin, in fact, sort of financed, you know, rebooting it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it's a great show. I really enjoy it.
I really enjoyed it too, you know. But I think it would be difficult, I think, for Tony to publish The Blessing Away today.
Yeah.
As a white Santa Fe reporter, even though he lived in Oklahoma and he had, you know, lots of connections.
Sure.
He wasn't actually Navajo.
I mean,
so they're
he probably still could, let's be honest. I'm sure he still could get it published probably today. But I think that now we are living in a time, thankfully, when there are, you know, lots of storytellers who are Indigenous that are able to step forward. And I don't know if you've read Never Whistle at Night, but it's an Indigenous anthology, and there are 28, you know, voices.
Well, we just sold out of it again.
Yes, I know. No. It's been an indie bestseller. It's incredible.
Yeah.
But I think it was something like, as part of that anthology, you know, when they did the call for it, they said, let's get a lot of people who've never been published before.
No, I think it's
and
wonderful.
So almost half the
We had Ramona Emerson here doing, you know, a contemporary Navajo story. Year ago, I think it was a year ago, January, something like that. And David, I never can remember all four names. David
Heskowinabli Wyden.
Yes, I know it. I always get it wrong.
Counts.
Loved, you know, his book.
And Deborah's here.
Right.
Eastern Band Cherokee. That's right.
I didn't know that, Deborah.
Right.
And your book was out in September. Right. I had no idea that you were actually Cherokee.
That was my question. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So I'm Eastern Band Cherokee. My mother's people are from Western North Carolina. So her people probably hid.
Yeah.
Didn't do the trail.
Or a lot of people were able to escape on the trail too. There's, you know.
Very true.
Yep.
So the heart of the Smoky Mountains. So when I did my first series, took place there in Bryson City, and going back and doing the research, it's like nothing ever changed. You know, even 30 years later. What was it like, the research going back for you? I know that you said it back, you know, back in time. Let's say, but was it a readjustment that you had to remember back?
Absolutely. Yeah, because when you live in a place, and as a child, I had much different memories than as an adult doing research. I mean, so picture something really interesting about it is it sort of looks like the surface of the moon, because as part of the mining, there's chipped rock, or like mine tailings is what they call it. But they're huge. And my mom says, in fact, when she was a little girl, they look like mountains in the distance. And today they're still very, very large. And I remember as a kid, you'd take a piece of cardboard and you'd slide down it, and God knows it's full of lead and it's terrible. But boy, it was fun, right? Or we went to, they'd have high school parties out there or whatever, you know. So my memories often are of it in more of a nostalgic way. But of course, as an adult, when you look back and think, God, what if you had to raise your children in a place that has lead poisoning in the air and in the water? And you know, through the years, I did do different, actually in college and stuff, research projects, because picture is such a kind of part of where I'm from. And so I had at least somewhat of a knowledge, but now going back and thinking about particularly where this is set, which is 2008, which is a big tipping point, you know, what would it have really been like for the people who lived there, like the community, you know, not just maybe a science paper I wrote in college, or not as a kid who had fun going down a shot pile, but like, what's it really like to be a parent and knowing that your home and the place that you raised your child is dangerous, and that you expose them to that. Like, what's that feel like? And then for people to come in and say, oh, your house is not worth what you say it is. And you to think, what am I even going to do with this money? And where am I even going to be able to afford to buy another house? Like, there's just some problems that I wouldn't have seen, you know, at those ages. And as an adult now with a family, you know, I would just really felt for the people in that community.
Yes, I always have a too question.
I love it.
So what was your most difficult part in writing this book? And then what was, I don't know, the least difficult or the more, the least painful part?
Well, the most fun I had was there's a character named Raina, and she's a crazy cousin, and I loved writing her. I mean, first of all, Cherokees are funny and Okies are funny, so there's a lot of humor in this book because that's important to me. My dad's really funny. He's not Cherokee, but he is an Okie, and humor is important. So Raina was a funny character, and she's kind of the wild cousin who, has maybe been to prison, and she's like the cool one who you always want to hang out with, who's always listened to good music and knew everything she wasn't supposed to know. So I had a blast writing her, and she was kind of like a breath of fresh air and kind of an intense story. Something that was hard for me to figure out is a character in here that's called Ghost Luna. And basically my main character has a lot of trauma because her friend was murdered, and she saved her sister and not her friend. And for me to write about trauma, I wanted to sort of articulate it in a way, like for a while it was like a panic attack for her. She was like having panic attacks, like that wasn't really working. And I talked to my editor about it. And we were discussing like, how else can we communicate trauma? And I thought, well, this is a little different, but not for Indigenous literature, but what if we made a ghost? And what if her trauma is like a ghost? Because honestly, I think that is kind of what trauma is. It follows us around like a ghost, maybe our whole lives. And so I created Ghost Luna, who was sort of this teenage remembrance of the friend who died, to follow her around from time to time, especially during times of stress. And was also kind of a petulant teenager, like popping her gum and another kind of break, but figuring that out and also kind of trusting myself to do that because it's a little different, was scary. And often I find when I'm scared or I have like a lot of anxiety, it usually means it's something I need to do. But it just takes me a little while to finally get to the place where I'm like, okay, this is going to be hard, or I'm putting myself out there a little bit, but this is the right thing to do kind of creatively from a writing perspective.
Has anybody read it who actually like lived during that time? You know what I mean?
In 2008? Oh, for sure. Yeah. I just had a book event. I feel like most of the people just got it in my town, so I'll probably hear a lot more soon. I have read a couple reviews of people, sort of just saying they remember this or they remember that. I mean, a lot of the history is really based on like news coverage and things. So I don't know. I think it's possible it's some people might feel a certain way about it, but I do feel like I was pretty fair because there just were a lot of sides to it. And it's still a very raw issue in the community. I mean, 2008 really wasn't that long ago. And, there's still some pain around it.
That's it. Patrick, anything from you?
Well, we've already talked about this a little bit, but the question is, where's Vanessa from and where were you raised? Was it Oklahoma?
Yeah, so the story is set in northeastern Oklahoma, right in the very corner on that kind of Kansas-Missouri border. And so there's the biggest town in Ottawa County is Miami, and it's spelled like Miami, Florida, but pronounced Miami. And I'm from that town. It's about 11,000 people. And one town basically, or two towns barely over, is Pitcher. And so I grew up right next to Pitcher. And Miami is in this book. And I would say it's maybe a little hard on Miami people, myself included, because it's a little bit of a judgment on people. I mean, I feel like we look down on people from Pitcher. In fact, there's a term chat rat, which is what people will call people from Pitcher. But that felt really justified to me because, looking back, it wasn't a kind thing to do and it wasn't very nice. And so I did write from a perspective of a person who really lived there and remembered how it was. But yeah, it's all northeastern Oklahoma where I'm from. And I really loved writing about the place I'm from. I wrote it mostly during the pandemic, and it's the longest I've ever been away from Oklahoma. I wasn't able to go home and see my family. So it did feel really nice to kind of go back, even if it wasn't actually go back, but in my mind and memory, and tell people, about the place I'm from.
What took you away from?
College. And I was one of those kids that always wanted to move away. I really was. And Sid, my character, has that as well. But for her, I pushed it pretty far. For me, it wasn't anything in particular. I just wanted to see other places. And I think for her, it is a chip on her shoulder. And it's actually, she feels a lot of guilt around it. And so I did kind of write that into her because I knew, at least from the perspective of, do people think it's a judgment because I left a place? And I could push that even further, like in her character development.
Well, thank you, online audience. That was really interesting. I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. Let's give our author a round of applause.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
And if you'd like to visit with her further and you want to get a book signed, please step up. And why don't you just stay there, because then you're at the right height for everything.
Great. Thank you all so much.